Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
They want us to clean up Washington, fix the system, and give them their voice back. They want to be able to get to the ballot box without having to run an obstacle course. They want it to be easy, not hard, to register and vote in America. And H.R. 1 will address that concern.
In their first act in power, House Democrats have introduced a major bill to expand voting rights in the United States. We'll speak with Ari Berman of Mother Jones, who calls the legislation the most far-reaching democracy reform plan introduced in Congress since the Watergate era. Then we look at why some Green New Deal advocates are criticizing House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's new committee on climate change. Then to surviving R. Kelly.
You have this, powerful person that's beloved in the African-American community. And then you have a victim that nobody cares about. And the greater society perpetuates stereotypes about black women that internally you start to believe. We'll believe it if it's a convenient excuse not to have to deal with the reality of R. Kelly and how we've been supporting and enabling him for decades.
We'll look at the stunning new 6-part TV documentary series about celebrated R&B singer and producer R. Kelly, who's been accused for decades of abuse, predatory behavior, and pedophilia, but has been able to avoid criminal conviction. We'll speak to the founder of the Mute R. Kelly campaign and to a father who alleges his daughter has become part of what he calls Kelly's sex cult. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The partial government shutdown is now in its third week as the impasse over President Trump's demand for $5.7 billion in border wall funding shows no signs of abating over the weekend. Trump threatened to call a national emergency if no agreement is made.
We're looking at a national emergency because we have a national emergency. Just read the papers. We have a crisis at the border of drugs, of human beings being trafficked all over the world. They're coming through. And we have an absolute crisis, and of criminals and gang members coming through. It is national security. It's a national emergency.
Democratic lawmakers swiftly condemned the idea, calling into question the legality of the move. Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, called the idea a non-starter Sunday, saying, quote, if Harry Truman couldn't nationalize the steel industry during wartime, this president doesn't have the power to declare an emergency and build a multi-billion-dollar wall on the border. On Sunday, Trump said he'd push for the construction of a steel barrier instead of concrete, presenting the idea as a compromise for Democrats. He also repeated the idea Mexico would pay for the wall through the USMCA trade deal, which would create billions in revenue for the United States. The USCMA has yet to be ratified by Congress. Federal agencies have been ordered to suspend planned pay raises for top administration officials amidst the ongoing shutdown. The raises had been set to go into effect on Sunday after a long-standing pay freeze for senior officials lapsed. 800,000 federal workers have either been furloughed or have been working without pay since the government shutdown started. The 380,000 furloughed workers will not receive back pay, and Trump canceled their January 1st raise. In Jerusalem, National Security Advisor John Bolton said U.S. military withdrawal from Syria would happen only after ISIS is defeated and if Turkey would guarantee they would not try to destroy U.S.-trained Syrian Kurdish fighters. Bolton's comments contradicted Trump's initial announcement from December 19th, ordering an immediate withdrawal and declaring the U.S. had won against ISIS. At a cabinet meeting last week, Trump also contradicted his December announcement, stating, I never said fast or slow. Bolton also said the U.S. would absolutely assure the security of Israel and other regional allies. Bolton set to meet with officials in Turkey today. While at a joint news conference with Bolton, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called on the U.S. to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights.
We'll go up to the Golan Heights, again, depending on the weather. The Golan Heights is tremendously important for our security. And I think that when you're there, you'll be able to understand perfectly why we'll never leave the Golan Heights and why it's important for that all countries recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1981 after capturing the territory from Syria during the 1967 war, but the international community does not recognize its sovereignty. In November, the U.S. said it planned to vote against a UN resolution calling for Israel to end its occupation of the Golan Heights. In Yemen, a U.S. airstrike killed one of the suspected masterminds behind the suicide bombing of the USS Cole in 2000, which killed 17 sailors and wounded at least 40 others. Al-Qaeda militant Jamal al-Badawi was indicted on terrorism charges in 2003, but twice escaped prison in Yemen. The airstrike and al-Badawi's death, which reportedly occurred on January 1st, was confirmed Sunday in tweets by President Trump and U.S. Central Command. Meanwhile, Pentagon Chief of Staff Kevin Sweeney announced he was resigning Saturday. Sweeney's resignation comes just over 2 weeks after Mattis stepped down as Secretary of Defense, publicly rebuking Trump's foreign policy moves. He's the third senior Pentagon official to resign since Trump announced the U.S. would withdraw troops from Syria. Pentagon spokesperson Dana White also left her position last week. White was being investigated for ethics violations at the time of her departure. In France, the Yellow Vest protesters took to the streets again over the weekend. On Saturday, a group of protesters in Paris rammed a forklift into a government ministry building while violent confrontations between some demonstrators and police took place in the capital. A reported 50,000 people across France came out as the movement heads towards its second month of protests. On Sunday, hundreds of women organized their own Yellow Vest demonstrations in an effort to counter the recent violence and to highlight the economic issues faced by working women. This is protester Sophie Tissier.
There are thugs who slip into the protests, and they're mainly men. And we're telling them, we, the Yellow Vest women, want to do something peacefully, calmly. We are calling for our women's rights to protest and to take part in the struggle. It's very, very hard for women in this society. It's mainly us who look after the children. We have lower salaries than men. Lots are employed in unstable jobs. It's much harder for women in today's society. It's a lot more difficult.
The Intercept is reporting that the Senate, in its first legislative act, will take up a bill that aims to prevent opposition to the Israeli government by allowing state and local governments to boycott any U.S. companies which are engaged in a boycott against Israel. The Combating BDS Act is part of multiple foreign policy measures contained in Bill S-1. It's sponsored by Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio and is similar to, though reportedly less extreme than, a measure introduced last year by Democratic Senator Ben Cardin, where it was met with condemnation from free speech advocates. The Intercept reports 26 states currently have laws sanctioning entities which support a boycott of Israel, which can entail punishment of individuals working for employers subject to anti-boycott laws. Pope Francis appealed to Italy and Malta to allow a group of nearly 50 migrants aboard 2 rescue ships to disembark at their ports. The migrants have been stranded on the ships in the Mediterranean for 2 weeks, and leaders in Italy and Malta are refusing to let the boats dock. Pope Francis asked for the countries to show concrete solidarity to the migrants. Meanwhile, Spanish authorities say they rescued nearly 550 migrants at sea over the weekend. New clues are emerging in the mysterious case of U.S. diplomats in Cuba who experienced health problems after being exposed to an unidentified high-pitched sound in their homes. Scientists said Friday the high-pitched sounds released in a recording by the Associated Press were made by crickets rather than a sonic or microwave weapon, as some have speculated. In 2016, staff at the U.S. Embassy in Cuba began reporting unexplained symptoms, including hearing loss, dizziness, nausea, and memory loss, after hearing the sounds. Last month, doctors in Florida said the diplomats had suffered physical damage to their ears, though the cause of the damage remains unknown. The State Department withdrew much of its diplomatic staff from Havana and expelled Cuban diplomats from the U.S. following what they believed to be a targeted attack. In a rare move, the Justice Department acknowledged flaws and errors in a January 2018 report that linked terrorism and immigration. However, they are refusing to retract or edit the report. The report, entitled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States, was released to support Trump's March 2017 travel ban barring entry to citizens from 6 majority Muslim countries. A man has been arrested and charged with capital murder over the killing last week of 7-year-old Jasmine Barnes in Houston, who was shot while in a car with her mother and 3 sisters. The suspect was originally believed to be a white man in a possibly racially motivated shooting, but police now say Eric Black Jr. was responsible in what's likely a case of mistaken identity. Police say Black was driving the car where the deadly shot came from. They apprehended him after receiving a tip from journalist Sean King. A second suspect is thought to be in custody, but his identity is yet to be confirmed by police. In Nevada, death row prisoner Scott Dozier died of apparent suicide Saturday. Dozier had been scheduled to die by lethal injection in July 2018, but a judge halted the execution just hours beforehand after a pharmaceutical company successfully sued to prevent the use of its drug, midazolam, to be used as part of a 3-drug lethal cocktail. The cocktail would have also included the drug fentanyl. Dozier, who was convicted of 2 murders, had been placed on suicide watch after previous suicide attempts. He was found hanging from a bedsheet inside his prison cell. In Torrance, Southern California, 3 men were killed and 4 others wounded after shots were fired at a bowling alley late Friday night. The victims were identified as Aston Edwards, Robert Meekins, and Michael Radford. Police have not yet publicly identified any suspects. In South Carolina, 2 sheriff's deputies will be charged over the deaths of 2 women who drowned in a van that flooded during Hurricane Florence. 45-year-old Wendy Newton and 43-year-old Nicolette Green were in law enforcement custody at the time of their deaths after they had both gone to hospitals where they were involuntarily committed and detained. Joshua Bishop is charged with involuntary manslaughter, and Stephen Flood is charged with involuntary manslaughter and reckless homicide. You can go to our website at DemocracyNow.org to see our coverage of this story. In Washington, D.C., a court of appeals ruled in favor of President Trump's ban on transgender people serving in the military. The decision overturned an earlier ruling by a D.C. federal judge blocking the policy for being unconstitutional. The ban, which seeks to restrict military service for transgender people who experience gender dysphoria, replaced an earlier ban on all transgender service members that was announced in July of 2017. Other injunctions against the ban are still in effect. The Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to take on the case. In New York City, a trial kicks off today challenging the Trump administration's attempt to end temporary protected status, known as TPS, for 50,000 Haitians living in the U.S. Tens of thousands of Haitians were given TPS after an earthquake devastated Haiti in 2010. In November 2017, the Trump administration announced it would revoke TPS for Haitians. The move was met with protests and multiple lawsuits. In October, a federal judge temporarily blocked the Trump effort, which also affects immigrants from Sudan, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, citing a discriminatory motivation. Haitian TPS recipients and their supporters are expected to rally outside the Brooklyn courthouse today. And Indigenous land defenders in Western Canada say a raid on their encampments is imminent. Members of the Unist'ot'en and the Gidimt'en clan have been physically blocking entry to native Wet'suwet'en territory, where TransCanada Corporation planned to build the massive $4.7 billion Coastal GasLink pipeline. Last month, a judge granted a temporary injunction for access by Coastal GasLink workers. Reports emerged over the weekend of chartered police buses arriving in the area to defy the 2 Wet'suwet'en roadblocks. This is Molly Wickham of the Gidimt'en clan speaking Saturday night.
You know, people like to think that things have gotten a lot better in so-called Canada and in our communities, and that things aren't the same that they were 150 years ago. But that's just a fallacy. It's false. Because we know right now in this reality that the state is willing and capable of using the same kinds of violence that they've used against our people for the last 150 years here.
Molly Wickham of the Gidimt'en clan in Western Canada speaking Saturday night. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Voting rights advocates are hailing a new House bill that aims to restore voting rights to millions, crack down on the influence of dark money in politics, restore December. The landmark Voting Rights Act established automatic and same-day voter registration and other measures. On Friday, Democratic Congressmember John Sarbanes of Maryland introduced the bill.
We heard loud and clear from the American people that they feel left out and locked out too often from their own democracy, that they want us to fight the culture of corruption. They want us to clean up Washington, fix the system, and give them their voice back. They want to be able to get to the ballot box without having to run an obstacle course. They want it to be easy, not hard, to register and vote in America. And H.R. 1 will address that concern.
The bill has been dubbed the For the People Act. It's the first act of legislation introduced by the new Democratic majority in the House. Longtime civil rights and Congressman John Lewis praised the legislation.
I said on many occasions that the vote is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument of transformation we have in our democracy, we have in a democratic society. And at the foundation of our system, it must be strengthened and preserved. There are forces trying to make it harder and more difficult for people to participate. And we must drown out these forces.
Meanwhile, in other voting rights news, the Supreme Court agreed Friday to hear two cases involving partisan gerrymandering in the states of North Carolina and Maryland. Voting rights activists fear the court may uphold partisan gerrymandering, could even bar states from forming independent commissions to draw congressional districts. We're joined now by Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Nation Institute, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His latest piece, Democrats' First Order of Business, Making It Easier to Vote and Harder to Buy Elections. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Ari. Explain this first act in the Democratic House.
It's a huge bill. It basically includes so many things that democracy reform advocates have been arguing for decades are necessary. It really is the most important democracy reform bill introduced since the Watergate era. On voting rights, it would include things like automatic voter registration, election day registration, restoring voting rights to ex-felons, making Election Day a federal holiday. This is the most significant voting rights bill probably since the introduction of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. On money and politics, it would include public financing of congressional elections, which would be huge to try to counteract the amount of dark money that we see in the system right now, the huge amount of corporate money that we see in the system right now. And on ethics and lobbying reform, one of the things it does is say that any sitting president and vice president has to release their tax returns, which of course is so important because Donald Trump was the first candidate and the first president in 40 years not to release his taxes. So taken together, massive expansion of voting rights, a crackdown on dark money, huge lobbying and ethics reform. It's incredibly significant. This was the first thing that House Democrats said they wanted to do out of the gate. And
what are its chances of not just passing in the House, but, of course, being enacted because it's President Trump who has to sign off on it?
Well, it has no chance right now. I mean, all the things I just talked about are anathema to President Trump and to Mitch McConnell, who controls the Senate. I think it has a very good chance of passing in the House. But when it comes to the Senate, when it comes to President Trump, this is as much a political document as a legislative document. What House Democrats want to do is they want to say, this is what we stand for, this is what we believe in, and this is what our democracy needs. And by discussing the legislation, then also holding hearings on these things. Because remember, Amy, they're going to hold hearings on voter suppression. They're going to hold hearings on dark money. They're going to hold hearings on President Trump's taxes. All of that stuff is going to get attention to things that have been often dismissed as quote-unquote good government issues. These aren't just good government issues. These are issues that get to the core of our democracy, the core of our politics.
So on Friday, the Supreme Court agreed to revisit this question of whether the Constitution prohibits extreme partisan gerrymandering. Talk about the significance of this.
Well, gerrymandering has completely warped our democracy. We're seeing in state after state after state, Republicans are getting a minority of votes, but a majority of seats. And that's not how we think about politics. We think of politics as the person who gets the most votes wins the election. That's not happening. You look at the last election. In Wisconsin, Republicans got 46% of the vote in the state assembly and 64% of the seats. And that's because of gerrymandering. And Democrats do it too. So what we're seeing is the Supreme Court's going to hear these gerrymandering cases from North Carolina, where the Republicans gerrymandered, and from Maryland, where the Democrats gerrymandered. Now, a reason reasonable person would look at this and they'd say, okay, you have Republicans gerrymandering in North Carolina, you have Democrats gerrymandering in Maryland. This must be a problem that we have to deal with. The Supreme Court, however, looks to be taking the opposite approach. They seem to be saying that we don't believe partisan gerrymandering is a problem, despite all of the factors that we see, despite all of the evidence we see of gerrymandering. The Supreme Court has basically said, we don't care. They took these cases in 2016 and they punted. They basically sent them back to the lower courts. The lower court struck down these gerrymandered maps in North Carolina, in Wisconsin, in Maryland. Now it's going back to the Supreme Court. And the worry here is that the 5-member conservative majority is going to tell states partisan gerrymandering is okay, which is going to open the door to rampant gerrymandering, even more rampant gerrymandering following the 2020 election when the next census comes out.
You mentioned North Carolina. What's happening in the 9th Congressional District?
Well, what happened in the 9th Congressional District...
And explain where that is.
Sure. The 9th Congressional District basically goes from Charlotte all the way down to eastern North Carolina. And what we saw there was essentially massive election fraud committed by the Republican candidate Mark Harris and his allies in that race to try to win a congressional race. And it's very ironic that you had Republicans all across the country screaming voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud during the last election, but it was their party and their candidate that committed massive election fraud to try to win a congressional race. So what's happening now is the State Board of Election in North Carolina has not certified that race. So Mark Harris, the Republican, was not seated in the new Congress. The State Board of Election there is going to hold a hearing, and we're going to see what's going to happen. My guess is there's almost certainly going to be a new election in North Carolina at some point this year.
Talk about what's happening in Florida. Tomorrow is a major deadline.
Huge day. So in the last election, Florida voters restored voting rights to ex-felons. There was an amendment called Amendment 4. 64.5% of the public approved it, which was a huge number, basically saying that people that have paid their debt to society should get their voting rights back. That could lead to up to 1.4 million people getting their right to vote back. And tomorrow is the day in which ex-felons in Florida can register to vote for the first time. This is a huge day for democracy in Florida. However, there is a lot of confusion surrounding this because the new Republican governor, the new Republican legislature, they have not said whether people should be able to register tomorrow. The amendment is very clear. Starting on January 8th, ex-felons who have paid their debt to society, who have a clean record now, should be able to register to vote. However, the governor has basically said the legislature needs to pass a bill implementing the law. What voting rights supporters say in Florida is this is very clear. If you have paid your debt to society, if you have a clean record, you should be able to register to vote tomorrow. So the people that led the effort to try to pass this law, the ex-felons themselves who weren't able to register, they are going to go to their local board of elections tomorrow. They are going to try to register to vote for the first time.
Let me turn to Desmond Meade, president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, chair of Floridians for a Fair Democracy. I spoke to him in November after Amendment 4 passed.
What we seen in Florida was love prevailing. Just that simple. Love prevailed. We had over 5 million votes for Amendment 4, and those votes were votes of love. People voting for their loved ones and friends who made mistakes and paid their debt and wanted to move on with their lives. And so we're very excited, and we think that this victory can serve as a bright spot for this country. It could serve as a launching pad for how we conduct business and how we can move issues along the lines of humanity and transcend above the partisan politics, transcend above the racial anxieties.
So that's Desmond Meade, who is really the major force, the engine behind this this amendment, this referendum that they voted on that would set an example for states around the country. Interestingly, the deadline tomorrow, people can not deadline exactly because people can start to register, which means they can register for 2020. And we're talking about over 1 million people. That begins tomorrow, the day that the man who's trying to stop this from happening, the new governor, Ron DeSantis, will be sworn in.
Well, it's really important to note that Florida had the worst felon disenfranchisement law in the country. 1 in 10 Floridians, including 1 in 5 African Americans in Florida, couldn't vote under this law, which is absolutely astonishing. Voters across the ideological spectrum repealed this. in the last election. Every single congressional district in Florida voted to repeal the state's felon disenfranchisement law. This was not a Democratic versus Republican issue. This was voters across the spectrum, many of them conservative, law and order Republicans who said, if you've paid your debt to society, you should have a second chance. And so I hope this doesn't become Republican versus Democrat, left versus right, like so often happens in our society. This is about giving people who have paid their debt to society their rights to vote back. And I would hope that every politician in Florida would encourage people to register to vote. Because you know what? You're going to see a lot of white Republicans, Amy, show up tomorrow and want to register to vote, just like you're going to see black Democrats or Latino independents. This is across the political spectrum. We have had such a problem with mass incarceration in Florida. So many people have lost their voting rights. And for the most important swing state in the country to potentially restore voting rights to over 1 million people, that could have a transformative impact on our democracy.
Finally, the issues you're looking at around voting rights that you think are the most important leading into the 2020 election.
Well, I think it's really important to note that we saw rampant voter suppression in the last election. We saw thousands of people turned away from the polls in places like Georgia and Florida and North Dakota. We haven't dealt with that yet. We haven't investigated that yet. And that's why this bill that we were talking about earlier, H.R. 1, is so important, because we have to say as a society, voter suppression is wrong, voter suppression is illegal, voter suppression is immoral, and we have to commit to everyone having a chance to vote in 2020. That didn't happen in 2018. There were way too many stories of people that couldn't vote for one reason or another. And I'm concerned that unless we deal with this, both in terms of bringing attention to it, but also passing new laws to make it easier to vote, that history is going to repeat itself in 2020. And we're going to see far too many barriers to the ballot box erected in advance of the next presidential election.
Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Nation Institute, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. When we come back, why are some advocates of a Green New Deal critical of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's new Committee on Climate Change? Stay with us. Slow Release by Nina Cherry here on Democracy Now! House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is facing criticism from some climate activists for failing to back a Green New Deal. Last week, Pelosi announced the formation of a new select committee on the climate crisis headed by long-standing Florida Congressmember Kathy Castor. But the committee is far weaker than what backers of a Green New Deal had envisioned. The committee will not have subpoena power or the power to draft legislation. One of the most prominent backers of the Green New Deal has been newly sworn-in New York Congressmember Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. On Sunday, she was interviewed on 60 Minutes by Anderson Cooper.
You're talking about zero carbon emissions, no use of fossil fuels within 12 years?
That is the goal. It's ambitious. And
how is that possible? Are you talking about everybody having to drive an electric car?
It's going to require a lot of rapid change that we don't even conceive as possible right now. What is the problem with trying to push our technological capacities to the furthest extent possible?
This would require, though, raising taxes.
There's an element where, people are going to have to start paying their fair share in taxes.
Do you have a specific on the tax rate?
you know, you look at our tax rates back in the 60s, and when you have a progressive tax rate system, your tax rate, you know, let's say from $0 to $75,000 may be 10% or 15%, et cetera. But once you get to like the tippy tops, on your $10 millionth dollar, sometimes you see tax rates as high as 60 or 70%.
For more, we go to Boston, where we're joined by Varshini Prakash. She's founder of Sunrise Movement, the youth-led climate group that's occupied and lobbied at congressional offices, including Nancy Pelosi's last month, with the woman we just heard, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. People risked arrest to demand adoption of the Green New Deal and bold climate leadership. Varshini Prakash, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what has been proposed. You know, when Nancy Pelosi did that historic gaveling in with the children and grandchildren of Congress members as well as her own. In her speech, she called out the Select Committee on the climate crisis. What do you think works about that committee, and what are you disappointed by?
Sure. Well, what we saw last week was we were very glad to see that Nancy Pelosi mentioned the climate crisis in her address, but calling it a crisis and an existential threat and treating it like one are two very different things. So essentially, Nancy Pelosi is reviving a 10-year-old committee, the Select Committee for the Climate Crisis, but we find that it's actually woefully and inexcusably falls short of what we need in this moment in terms of climate ambition in this crucial juncture in history. Namely, it falls short in three ways, some of which you already mentioned. It doesn't include anything about creating a draft, sort of a blueprint for a plan for a Green New Deal over the next year ahead of the next presidential election. It doesn't include any provision that actually bars people who are taking money from oil and gas executives and lobbyists who are jeopardizing my generation's future from sitting on the committee, something that, frankly, we find to be a conflict of interest. And thirdly, it doesn't include any power to subpoena, which actually renders this committee less powerful than the one we had even a decade ago. So we were feeling really disappointed that Nancy Pelosi had failed to follow the leadership of the 45 members of Congress, including some of the freshest faces of the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Joe Neguse, so many more, in calling for a select committee for a Green New Deal. And we've seen the hurricanes get bigger. We've seen fires level entire cities and towns. We've seen people struggling to breathe clean air and drink fresh water, fresh and clean water, and are not seeing the Democratic Party step up with the level of climate ambition that we actually need that has been mandated by UN climate scientists.
Last week, Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "In D.C. and even in our own party, it's apparently too controversial to ask that we keep oil and gas companies away from enviro policy." Your response, Varshini?
Absolutely. I mean, putting somebody who takes oil and gas money on a committee to stop the climate crisis is akin to pouring oil on a fire and expecting to put it out. We're talking about a fundamental conflict of interest. People who are taking money from the corporations and individuals who have spent the last 50 years misinforming the public on the science, misleading the public on the science willfully, and buying out politicians on both sides of the aisles. For sure, the GOP, but also a large number of Democrats should not be having a seat at the table in crafting and holding these public hearings and informing the public about the severity of the crisis and building the consensus around the solutions to do it. We'd be hard-pressed to really support somebody to sit on this committee who hasn't taken the no fossil fuel money pledge, which is why we have been why we have been pushing for Representative Kathy Castor to take the pledge.
Did you want Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez to head this committee?
Sure, we definitely think it would be a positive if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were able to participate and push this committee in some way. But frankly, we are seeing that our options through institutional means through this committee are not really going to happen in the ways that we wanted. So we're actually looking at not just pushing this select committee on a climate crisis to be better and push for the real solutions to the climate crisis, what UN climate scientists are saying, unprecedented levels of change to our economy and our society over the next 12 years. We actually are realizing that we need to take this fight to a Green New Deal beyond the Beltway and to the American people.
Pelosi's office said they'd meet with you, have they?
Yes, we met with them prior to the announcement about the select committee.
And what came out of that discussion?
Well, largely they said they were supportive of our aims and then created the select committee for a climate crisis. So it feels a little bit a bit of a contradiction to say that they're on our same page, but not to include any of the clear demands and provisions that we had asked for previously. It's clear that the Select Committee for the Climate Crisis is largely going to be a number of public hearings or information gathering, and frankly, the time to raise awareness about the crisis is over. And at this point in history, we need to start developing the plans to actually confront the crisis and lay the groundwork. We're clear that we're not going to be able to ramrod legislation through in the 116th Congress. That's obvious. With a Trump administration that is completely bought and sold by fossil fuel executives and a climate-denying Senate. But we can start to lay the groundwork in these next 2 years for what an actual plan might look like. And that is an opportunity that Democrats are missing right now.
You did not get your demand for fossil fuel-funded lawmakers not to serve on the committee. Will you protest those or highlight those that are chosen for this committee? Will you ask that they stop accepting that money?
Absolutely. I think we will ask every single member on this committee to reject oil and gas contributions, oil and gas executive and lobbyist contributions, and prioritize the health and well-being of our democracy, our society, and our climate instead.
Varshini Prakash, I want to thank you for being with us, founder of the Sunrise Movement, speaking to us from Boston. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we look at a stunning 6-part documentary series that is just airing on Showtime called that's just airing on Lifetime, called Surviving R. Kelly. Stay with us.
This is for Beatrice Bertha, Benjamin, who gave birth to Tidi Azita, for Lavender Hill, for Kalisha, Mitchell's Plain, Swazi girls, I'm repping for the Manenberg, Kubuletu, where you just be blessed to get through, for beauty shining through like the sun at the highest noon, from the top of the cable car at Table Mountain, I am you. Girls with the sky is blue of eyes and the darkest skin, for cape-colored call, for realizing we're African. For all my cousins back home, the strength of mommy's backbone, the length of which she went for raising, sacrificing her own, the pain of not reflecting, the range of our complexions, for rubber pellet scars on Auntie Elna's back, I'm on just great, caramel shining in all our glory, for Mauritius, St. Helena, my blood is a million stories, Winnie for Jonah, for Edie, for Norma, Leslie and Dee Dee, for Auntie Betty, for Melanie, all the same family, Fiona, Joe Berg, complex of mixed girls, for surviving through every lie they put into us now. This world's yours, and I swear I will stand focused. Black girls, raise up your hands. The world.
Black Girl Pain, Talib Kweli featuring Jean Grey. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with the shocking Lifetime 6-part documentary series called Surviving R. Kelly. The series, which aired over 3 nights this past weekend, chronicles 2 decades of allegations of sexual assault and misconduct against the celebrated R&B singer-producer R. Kelly. This is a part of the trailer for the series.
There's a difference between R. Kelly and Robert. R. Kelly's this fun, laughing, loving guy. But Robert is the devil.
R. Kelly is at the top of the charts, but he may be in for a fall. He was arrested today on 21 counts of child pornography.
Kelly is accused of videotaping himself having sex with an underage girl.
Taking advantage of minors will not be tolerated.
Jurors found him not guilty on all charges.
Robert has said all along he would be cleared of these terrible charges.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you! Mute R. Kelly! Mute R. Kelly! Mute R. Kelly! Mute R.
That was the trailer for the documentary series Surviving R. Kelly. R. Kelly has been accused of abuse, predatory behavior, pedophilia throughout his career. But despite damning evidence and multiple witnesses, he's been able to avoid criminal conviction. Kelly married the late singer Aaliyah in 1994 when she was just 15. He was 27. The couple denied the marriage took place. It was later annulled. In 2002, Kelly was indicted for possession of child pornography after a tape surfaced that appeared to show him having sex with a teenage girl. A jury found him not guilty in 2008 after deciding they could not identify the girl. For many years, Kelly reached out-of-court settlements with women who accused him of abuse, some who signed non-disclosure agreements that kept them from speaking out about the allegations. However, after a 2017 BuzzFeed article reported R. Kelly is keeping women against their will in an abusive cult, survivors and parents of victims have come forward with new allegations about his sexual, mental, and physical abuse. This is Angelo and Alice Clary, parents of Asriel Clary, who met R. Kelly when she was 17.
The way they had to exit was through the back. So during that time, we was waiting and kind of getting a little nervous. Went to the corner where the VIP was, and then that's where she exited at, from the back side of the stage. He told us that he asked her to hear us sing. He liked it, so he gave her a number to contact him.
Asriel was in the 11th grade. We didn't find out right away, but she was secretly, I guess, calling him and texting him and had been talking to him on the phone. One day, the time that she's supposed to be home, I called and she wasn't home yet. Finally, we get a phone call. She finally called me and said, "Oh, I'm at a hotel in Kissimmee meeting with R. Kelly." How and why, did this happen? I was really shocked.
That was from the documentary series Surviving R. Kelly, and we'll be speaking with Angelo Clary in Las Vegas in a moment. The series will re-air in its entirety on Lifetime on Friday, January 11th. Well, for more, we are going to Arnike Odiele, co-founder of Mute R. Kelly, a campaign to end R. Kelly's music career, and an Atlanta-based arts administrator who is also featured in this documentary. Arnike, welcome to Democracy Now! This series is just heartrending, horrifying. For people who aren't so familiar with R. Kelly, tell us who he is and when the allegations started surfacing, why you're so deeply concerned about him and have really co-founded a movement against him.
Well, R. Kelly is a internationally recognized singer, songwriter, producer who's had a number of hits over the last couple of decades that have cemented him in a lot of people's mind as the king of R&B. He is beloved in the African-American community for some of the more inspiring and uplifting songs that he's written, like I Believe I Can Fly and Step in the Name of Love. I mean, those are staple songs at African-American weddings and graduations, and so he's very steeped in the culture. I first heard the allegations
R. Kelly,
when
short
I was
for
maybe
Robert
14,
Kelly.
15, around Aaliyah's age, about that marriage. And I can remember, thinking that was outrageous from, a kid's point of view. And then many years passed, and I didn't hear anything else really, going on with my life, go to college, just wrapped up in other circles. And so hadn't heard anything else until June, I believe it was, of 2017, when the allegations came out about what the media was calling sex cults in his home in Johns Creek, which is right outside of Atlanta. And at the time, I was sitting in my office, and I, heard this on the news, and I just did a Google search. I was like, what is this? I haven't heard anything about R. Kelly in years. And when I did that Google search, I found article after article after article after article about all the allegations, all the court cases that had come up since Aaliyah. We're talking about 25 years worth of women coming out and saying that this person abused me, this person is violent, they started a sexual relationship with me when I was underage, and they were asking for the community's help and were being largely ignored. And I just became incensed. I mean, I really just sat at my desk in my office fuming, like, you know, how dare we let this go on for 25 years at the expense of dozens upon dozens of young black women. So I didn't know what to do. I'm not an activist by any kind of training, but I just was like, you know, I'm just going to start a petition, a really humble petition, to try to get him off of Atlanta radio. Atlanta especially cannot afford to support child molesters. We have a huge child sex trafficking problem in Atlanta. And I just was like, we just can't. We all know this to be true, regardless of the fact that we have to say alleged in front of all of these accusations. Everybody saw that tape of him sexually degrading a 14-year-old girl. Regardless of whether or not he was convicted, 21 video instances of himself engaged in sex with underage girls were removed from his home. We all know he forged documents to marry a 15-year-old Aaliyah, who he had been mentoring since she was 12. So we know what this man is about. And we as a community need to say, even if we can't put him in jail, we're not going to give him our money anymore. We're not going to financially support the lifestyle that we know that he's living. And so I started that petition. And then Kenyette Tisha Barnes reached out to me when she saw me on the news and said, I have got to help. I've been doing this work, you know, and I want to help. And the two of us formed Mute R. Kelly and decided that not only were we going to try to get him off the radio, but we were going to try to get his concerts canceled. And we were going to try to get him off of streaming. We were going to make it impossible for other artists to want to work with him. We were going to cut off the money at every turn that we could, because it's really his money that is insulating him from the consequences of his crimes. And so if you stop the money, you stop his ability to hide. And so that's where Mute R. Kelly was born.
I want to go to another clip from the docuseries Surviving R. Kelly. This is survivor Lisa Van Allen, followed by singer and former R. Kelly protege Sparkle. Sparkle's niece is allegedly the 14-year-old in the sex tape video for which R. Kelly faced but was acquitted of child pornography charges.
You know, I was kind of surprised when I actually ended up meeting him, because I just thought I'd be the last one he would try to talk to, because I was probably the youngest one there. Rob was sitting there at the pool, and he was being really, really nice, and he asked me how old I was, and I told him I was 17, and he asked me, will your mother let you come to Chicago? I knew he was at least 31, so I thought when I said 17 that he'd be like, you know, like that was going to be the deal breaker. But it wasn't.
Young girls are impressionable. Like, he's R. Kelly. Now, look who I got. Look who's showing me interest. He's charismatic, funny, and he's an all-around nice guy. But Robert is a master manipulator. Like, everybody knows it now. They didn't know it back then.
I'd heard about Rob's reputation, about him dating Aaliyah, but I didn't assume that he liked younger girls. I just thought, at that moment, I just thought he liked me.
So that was Lisa Van Allen. And talk about the significance of this. And Sparkle's niece, the person Sparkle, who was a singer with Robert Kelly, with R. Kelly, alleges is her niece.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard documentary to watch, to see so many young women fall into this trap over and over again. But, you know, Sparkle is absolutely right. Young women are very impressionable. You know, and we say young women especially, but everyone is impressionable and is able to be manipulated by somebody that they look up to, they admire, they worship. I think, you know, there are grown people right now who have a celebrity who, if that celebrity dropped out of the sky and shone their spotlight on them, you know, would leave their husbands, wives, children, and go run off to LA tomorrow. So, you know, I think to think that children would be less susceptible to that type of temptation is ridiculous. You know, he has honed his trap at this point. When you hear all those lady stories stories, it's the exact same story over and over and over again. He's using, his charm, his looks, his fame, his money, his vulnerability as bait, and then he flips the script on them.
Arnike,
so it's really just unfortunate.
This is Geronda Pace from the documentary Surviving R. Kelly, who says, this is just an amazing story because she actually met him while she went to his trial almost every day, and he saw her as he was walking into court. She says she was 15 when she met Kelly.
I went to his trial because I was a super fan at the time. I didn't believe he was guilty, and I didn't want to believe that he was guilty. I was a freshman in high school. He was old for me to like him, but I fell in love with his music. After Robert's trial, his friend sent me a message and invited me to R. Kelly's party. And in the middle of me texting him back, Rob, he actually called my phone. And he was telling me, he said, I remember you. And I said, well, what do you remember me from? He said, you came to my trial. Thank you for your support. I was shocked. I felt like I was on top of the world.
That was survivor Geronda Pace, who alleges she was later sexually, mentally, and physically abused while living in a cult-like atmosphere in Kelly's home. Pace is now speaking out despite having received a cash settlement from R. Kelly in return for signing a non-disclosure agreement. And talk about, Arnike, these non-disclosure agreements.
Well, that's how he's been able to kind of cover his tracks for years. There's a lot of talk about, women accepting these cash settlements, but not talk about him making these cash settlements. Part of it is, when these cases come up, your lawyer takes a look at them and goes, you need to make this go away, right? This is not something we want out in the public. And so he offers them money for their silence. And I think that they are judged for that unfairly, because if we all think about our daughters, our nieces, the young people that we love in our life, would we want their name and their image and the terribly humiliating things that have happened to them all over the news forever? Women are forever judged and found guilty for any sexual indiscretion that they have for the rest of their lives. At this point, Monica Lewinsky could cure cancer, and there's still going to be a footnote on her legacy for something that happened decades ago. And who wants that for their child? What you want is for the person to pay for what they did. And if you're not able to get that in court for whatever reason, for statute of limitations, for lack of physical evidence, you want to make them pay however you can. And so many of these people took the cash settlement and the NDA to make it go away and to also save their daughters that humiliation of having their name dragged through the mud. I think if we want to create a society where people don't take money and they fight it to court and they fight to get justice, we have to create a society where victims are not going to be blamed and judged for the things that happen to them. We have to create a society where this is not going to follow you for the rest of your life and be the defining moment of your childhood. We have to create a society where people actually look at the facts and the evidence and not at the fame and the wealth and the smokescreen that money and fame are able to create in order to really kind of see the merits of the case and judge it on that. So I don't judge any of these women for taking money for their silence. I don't know that I would be able to put myself in their position. And they're extremely brave for coming out on this documentary and telling their most humiliating, degrading moment of their life to the entire world. I don't know many of us who would want to do that.
Arnike Odleye, I want to bring Angelo Clary into this discussion, the father of Esriel Clary, who met R. Kelly at the age of 17, moved in with him with hopes of advancing her music career. He hasn't seen his daughter in almost 4 years. Angelo, thanks so much for joining us from Las Vegas. Can you talk about what has happened to Esriel, what you understand took place?
Yes, I can. I think the situation with Esriel was more of a personal situation that the world don't really know about. There was a lot going on with Esriel prior to meeting R. Kelly, and that's what led up to her being able to go to the show with us and had to be at the show with us for her to even attend the show. Moving right in, she never moved right in. We had a open conversation with R. Kelly after the event that took place, and he gave her his phone number, and they started talking, I think, on a Sunday to each other. And on that Sunday, we had no idea that they was texting and already starting a relationship. That Monday, she's supposed to have been in school, and then she wound up not being in class. So when we called, she drove to school. She always drove through high school, so she was didn't report home at the right time. So I think my wife called, and then she called me and told me that Az wasn't home. So I called my son, who also went to school, and that's how we figured out she wasn't at school. We found out she left school early, and then we blew up her phone. Just kept calling. No answer. When we finally got our answer from her phone, she sent her mother a text and said she had a audition with R. Kelly. She had to leave school. She had to go over there and meet with him. So we was like baffled. So she told my wife that. My wife called me, said, hey, she at the hotel with R. Kelly. We need to get there. I leave work, she leave work. We wound up meeting at the hotel in Kissimmee, Florida, where we see his tour bus, my daughter's car. We go in there, went to the registration, asked them for R. Kelly. Nobody knew that where he was, or he was under that name, and they don't have a celebrity here. You know, they have to protect the celebrity. So we understood that. So we went in and started going door to door. Security was called, police was called for us disturbing the hotel. The security finally went up and found our daughter, went door to door, pulled the rooms. He had like a top floor with about 7, 8 rooms, and they found him and my daughter in the room together. We came down, they brung her down. Some kind of way they didn't bring him down. And the next thing we asked the officer there, where was R. Kelly? He was like, he's supposed to be on his way down, but he never came down. So we heard that he left. He went out the back door or whatever, he was gone. We was more concerned about our daughter at that time. We talked to her, asked her, you know, she put on this show for us, you know, hey, this is my career. He called me, you know, this is what it was. He asked me for an audition. I was like, yeah, but you know, you only supposed to went without telling one of us, period. I mean, we already talked about who he was, his background on the way home when she told us that he gave his number after the show when she went on stage and sung for him. So, you know, after that, we talked to her, went home. And then, which we didn't know, that they had already had a sexual intercourse that day. We found out a year later.
Your daughter was 17 years old?
She turned 18. She was 17 in Kissimmee.
We have to wrap up this
Florida.
Segment of our interview, Angelo, but we're going to do part 2 and put it online at DemocracyNow.org. But you have said that you don't think this could continue if these children weren't black girls and young women. Can you explain as we end with this comment?
I think the comment was this straight blunt that if the females was Caucasian, this would have been, it wouldn't have been to this amount of women or young girls, kids, or anything. It'll stop at 1, maybe 2 tops. I think in the black community that we want heroes, and we so scared to demolish somebody because of the good they make us feel with whatever talent they have, that we don't want to be the one to say, hey, we got to destroy him. And I think this is why it really drug on as long as it did, and he was so successful at getting away with it. But I really believe that, like now, with more people understanding that, I don't think
Angelo,
it's just a
Clara,
black
we have to leave
or white.
it there, but we're going to continue the discussion in part 2. People can go online at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.